Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. My name is Joshua Scarborough. I'm with the Truth Telling Project. I want to thank all of y'all for hopping on. We're going to get started very soon in the next 5 minutes. If you want to take us a little bit of time to get some water, get yourself situated, we really want to appreciate your time. Thank you so much for coming yet again. Um, we are going to have a section where our record teller will speak about their work, and then we're also going to do a discussion. So if you we like to start usually these meetings is by doing a land acknowledgement. You can basically put in the chat where you're coming from. If you know the native people who are from the land that you're currently occupying, you should put that in the chat. I'll add that to my name, and I will say I'm calling from occupied and unceded Susquehannock land in Pennsylvania. Um, and if you, I'm gonna add that. I'm right on the Susquehanna River actually, so I'm gonna add that to my name. You just drop that in the chat. And also, if you'd like to change in the same section, in the participant section, your pronouns, so we know how to call on you and refer to you, that would also be very much appreciated. We're going to start very briefly, just going to give some time for people to join. And I want to thank you again 3 times for coming. Okay. Thank you, Deanna, for putting in the chat, participating. Like I was saying before, the people who just joined, we usually open our event is to basically speak to where you're calling from and the people who, had the land taken from where you are. If you're in the United States or in a place where indigenous people have been displaced, we like to honor that. And I also want to encourage you to change your pronouns as well. I'll introduce myself. My name is Joshua Scarborough. I am a organizer with the Truth Telling Project. I work primarily with the Radical Truth Teller. To give a little background for what the Radical Truth Teller is and how it operates, the Radical Truth Teller essentially is a project that started from Support an Activist, a program that grew out of the 2014 Ferguson Uprising, which this organization was also a part of. Or grew out of when we were in Ferguson back in at this point, almost going at 20 years ago, we saw a need to support people on the ground who would normally not get support from these mainstream organizations and uh, groups that we are looking to basically support, because they are really in the fight, and sometimes they don't always get recognition that they normally would receive from, being a part of an academic or institution or a nonprofit or a lot of those groups. A lot of people who are putting their lives and their livelihoods on the line are not always, and very often are not, supported in that. So this is why we created Support Radical Truth Teller, to specifically uplift grassroots organizers and organizations. So today our Radical Truth Teller for this month, the month of May, is Luana Grave Sellers. Also, operating the name Low Country Villa. I'm going to just very briefly read the bio, and then I will let Sister Sellers speak for themselves and work and talk about their work and how they have been operating over the last couple of years. Give me one moment. A native-born New Yorker, Luana's passion for her Gullah Geechee roots has led her to become a cultural influencer and preservationist on Hilton Head Island. A self-described community activist and cultural influencer, Luana spends most of her days working towards residential equality for Hilton Head Island's local Gullah community as one of the native island leaders and a frequent speaker on sustaining Gullah culture. In 2019, she founded the Low Country Gullah Foundation, a nonprofit that raises funds to protect and preserve historic Gullah land for future generations. As a keynote speaker and community activist, she is doing her part to sustain and preserve Gullah Geechee culture for future generations. In 2021, she started Sankofa Communications, a visual media company from which she writes, directs, and produces culturally focused video shorts and documentaries. So I want you all to welcome Sister Sellers, and as just also support her. I will be dropping her Cash App in the chat. All of our Radical Truth Tellers do get direct support from us as an organization. We also encourage people who are listening to this and on the call to donate directly and to uplift our Radical Truth Teller. And without further ado, I want to pass it on.
Great, thank you so much, and good evening, everyone. And thank you so much, not only for coming tonight, but I'm also appreciative and truly, truly grateful and humbled by the fact that the Truth Tellers Project has recognized me for my work. The work that I've been doing in the Gullah culture is very important for a lot of different reasons, but most importantly to me, it's because it's become personal. I have recently, within the last few years, realized that I am what I now call myself a Gullah Geechee American. And so telling the Gullah Geechee American story is what I have decided to put my life's work into. And with that being said, I see my work as a journey, and what I have told anyone who will listen to me, that this journey is something that I'm more than happy to share with other people and make sure that they are learning and growing in the Gullah culture just like I am. So with that all being said, I'm really excited to share more about my work and the culture with you. So let me start this here. There we go. Okay, so what happened was, and I just mentioned that I had really kind of started to learn about my culture, but it all started with the fact that I was looking for something to do when I got to Hilton Head, and there's a local magazine, Hilton Head Monthly, that had wanted to include more Gullah culture and information and stories in their magazine. And so because of that, I offered to do their upcoming February Black History Month edition, because they really had not decided what they were going to do. And so that really started my writing career. Now, mind you, I have a degree in journalism and Black history, but I had never used either of them until I started writing. And what you're looking at right now are the covers for the first editions that I was able to write it. And so they've become very not only personal to me, but special in that it is the beginning of a career that I really wasn't expecting to be a part of. So part of what happened was when I wrote the Black History section, I wound up writing about 6 articles and 8,500 words. And the success of the magazines was so incredible and unexpected by them and me, because it wasn't something that I was really looking to do on a full-time basis. But the magazine became a collector's item, and people started sending the editions across the country and kind of hoarding the magazine, so much so that it went into reprint over 800% of its normal distribution. And so because the magazine was so excited with the response, they said, okay, so now what can you do? And so I came up with the idea of writing a series of articles called The First Families of Hilton Head. And what you're looking at is some of the different stories and families that I was able to cover. And so the articles that I started writing not only included the families, but other areas of the culture that just gave an idea of what the culture was, what the traditions were, and the importance of the families that started their lives on Hilton Head during the during the Civil War and right after the Civil War, when emancipation started. And so through that, there were so many other articles that I did, not only about the families, but also the Black businesses that are there, the Gullah Heritage Trail Tours, Life Before the Bridge, the Islands Black History, about the Gullah Museum. And so my writing just really took on a life of its own. And so through the work that I was doing, I really, out of being lazy, to be honest with you, a lot of people had started to ask me where they could get previous articles and everything. And so that's where Low Country Gullah was born. It really was born out of a need to find a place to put all of the writing that I had amassed over the years. And by the time I had created the website Low Country Gullah, I had amassed about 300 articles that I had done on the culture. And so again, it was no full plan. It was really a half-baked plan of just having a website where people could go to learn about the culture. But what happened from there is that it just grew into people wanting to follow me on social media and the writing that I do and all of the work that I do. And with the writing and the website, what I realized is that a lot of people not only enjoy reading articles, but they also enjoy watching videos. And so that's how my work just kind of blossomed into what it is today. But I realized early on that if I'm going to document the culture and if I'm going to preserve the culture, then I can't do the culture its due diligence if I don't also protect the land. And so that's where really the dual mission that Low Country Gullah has in preserving the culture as well as protecting the land. And so as I've been doing the different stories and articles, I started doing these documentaries. And the first one that I did, which is the Freedom Day, which is in the upper right corner, that was on Mitchellville and the First Families. But since then, I not only started doing the documentaries, but I opened up a YouTube channel where all of these are available for you to see if you're interested. From the Freedom Day, I went into another one on Juneteenth, and it turns out that it just came out, well, I had just finished it right before President Biden signed it into a holiday. So I had to go back into production to add the fact that it was a holiday and Biden's part in making it so. And so Juneteenth really became a favorite of mine. The Seeking is on the Gullah religious tradition. And then Harriet Tubman, which is my most recent one, is on Harriet Tubman's role and time in South Carolina. A lot of people do know about her time in the Underground Railroad, but most people aren't really informed about her work as a spy for the Union Army and her participation in the Combahee River Raid, which was the largest emancipation event of the Civil War. I can't not mention that I'm also really excited about the Harriet Tubman because it did just have its broadcast premiere in April on PBS. And so that has really taken on a life of itself. But, you know, I can't not also say that the work that I'm doing has really been pushed along by the ancestors and their guidance of what I'm able to do and this untold stories that I'm able to tell. And that really is the foundation of the work that I've been doing. So I can't talk about the Gullah culture without first talking about the transatlantic slave trade. And so with the transatlantic slave trade, it actually started with the Portuguese, who had been in Africa for decades, long before slavery came to America. And Pope Alexander VI was actually the person who authorized the rights for Europeans, including the Portuguese, to start enslaving Africans. And so that's where the African transatlantic slave trade began. Because at the time, the Portuguese in the 1600s were the largest maritime world superpower. And so they wanted to colonize Africa, teach them Christianity, as well as create a specific flow of money to support their empire, which they were primarily receiving from sugar. And so for the Portuguese, what they did is they started with Angola, which, as you can see from this map, is directly across from Brazil, which is where they had their sugar plantations. And so that's where the transatlantic slave trade started. And then from there, it became something that other European countries wanted to kind of get a piece of the action, but it was a triangular beneficial situation for all of the people involved. Of course, there was slavery in Africa between different tribes for generations, but what the Africans were getting out of the deal was they were being provided with manufactured goods that were brought to them. They were then trading those enslaved Africans. The Africans were brought over to the different colonies to do the labor, provide the raw materials, and then it would go back to Europe to be manufactured. And so all of that was going on, and especially in 1619, when the United States started to become active in the slave trade. Now, what happened is the process of moving and transporting the enslaved took potentially months. And sometimes they were transported or forced to come from as far as about 1,000 miles inland from Africa just to get to the coast. And so once they got to the coast, of course, it would take months for them to get to the United States or wherever they were going. A lot of the ships also started making stops in the Caribbean because there were also sugar plantations there, as well as Caribbean seasoning camps where they would take the enslaved to essentially break their spirit. But all of the time that the enslaved were together, that is really where the Gullah Geechee culture began to form, because out of a commonality of circumstance, they were together for a significant amount of time and needed to communicate. So if you think about it, there were about 10 different countries, so they had different languages, different traditions, and different cultures that they were all forced to blend together. And so if you look at this, it not only shows those 10 different, the areas that those 10 different countries within Africa where the enslaved people came from, but it also shows you all of the different ports where they were brought to. Charleston and Savannah, of course, Charleston was, of course, the largest port, but Savannah, Mobile, New Orleans, Galveston, Texas, and Amelia Island were also among some of the most active ports that were taking in enslaved people. And so by 1860, America had close to 4 million enslaved people that were worth a total of $3 billion in today's currency. And a lot of people think that slavery was really about the crops that they could produce, but the largest commodity that slavery had, at least in America, was in the labor, the human cargo or possessions that enslaved people were able to deliver. And so, as I mentioned, the Gullah Geechee came from about 10 different countries, and Angola was the largest country that enslaved people were taken from. Of course, there was Senegal, Gambia, Ghana, Sierra Leone, Madagascar, and Mozambique. And of course, this isn't a complete list. And as I mentioned, my journey learning about my Gullah roots has taught me that I am from Nigeria. And so Nigeria was also one of those countries that were on the list. So what's interesting about the Gullah Geechee is that along the coastline, yes, there were different crops and cotton was grown, but it tended to be a sea island cotton. Indigo was also being grown because it was what the British government or the king needed to make those rich blue uniforms that they wore. So indigo was a prime crop as well. But rice was the most important crop that the Gullah Geechee were brought over here for, because they were really skilled at what they were doing. And so because it was rice and not cotton, rice needs a large amount of people and human labor to harvest it. And so that's why the enslaved were brought over here. The colonists, they had rice, but they did not have the technology to be able to grow it. Along the coast, and especially in Georgetown County, South Carolina, that was the largest producer of rice worldwide. And eventually what happened is rice became the #1 agricultural crop in the United States. What was interesting about it is that rice needs fresh water and salt water to grow, which is exactly how the topography of the East Coast of the United States is. But in West Africa, rice, and in West Africa, the topography is actually very similar to the East Coast. And so in West Africa, because they had been growing rice successfully for centuries, that's why it was a perfect storm, so to speak, in order to make the rice successful that it was. And the sea islands along the coast is why it was the perfect location for them to grow Carolina gold rice. And if you look at this picture, this is a picture of a rice trunk. And in West Africa, what they were doing was, the technology that they had was they would take a tree and hollow out the tree so it was like a pipe, and be able to control the water flow and the salinity of the water that they use to go into the rice. And what you're seeing in this image is the Americanized version of what is still called a rice trunk. And this particular rice trunk is in Georgetown, South Carolina. And a lot of the rice trunks that they used back during slavery still exist today. And so the slave traders were very specific and very targeted in the type of enslaved people that they were capturing. The enslaved were very educated and very well versed in valuable skills, especially that kind of engineered farming that was needed to grow the rice. And this is another image of a rice trunk that's out of the water. And if you see the long section in the middle, that is usually between, there's some land or earth that goes above that. So each side would be where they would control the water. And they would take this large side over here, have it lift up so that the water could flow through that long section in the middle. And so because of the amount of enslaved people that it took to produce rice, as well as the amount of large plantations that were necessary to produce it, that's really what started the plantation era in the United States. And what's incredible about it is that the amount of wealth that it created was incredible. Charleston at one point was considered the, or they wanted it to be the capital of South Carolina because of the amount of wealth and political influence that the Charlestonians had. But they got all of that based on the labor and the backs of the enslaved that were able to provide that source of income. So what makes rice different as a crop is that it's really an extremely labor-intensive process, which requires between 100 to 300 laborers per 100 acres just to prepare the soil and harvest it by hand. And so what would happen is the work that they had to do was extraordinarily dangerous. And every day, because rice requires water, sometimes knee-high, ankle to knee-high water to be able to cultivate, the enslaved people actually had to stand in water for the majority of the day. And of course, if you've ever been in South Carolina, there is this mud that is what they call a thick pluff or gumbo mud, which is almost like quicksand. So being barefoot all of the time and having to stand in that thick kind of mud was also detrimental to their health and as well as their skin. And so the constant exposure to that kind of moisture would lead to not only severe skin conditions, but also rashes and ringworms. And of course, don't forget that they're in the water. There were leeches and insects, mosquitoes, no-see-ums, and huge horseflies that were incredibly intolerable across the coast. And in addition to being subjected to yellow fever and malaria. And so because of the danger and the conditions that rice slaves had, the average lifespan for a rice field slave was about 7 years, compared to the lifespan of the lifespan of field slaves that were doing cotton and other types of crops was about 7 years. The lifespan for a rice slave was about 3 years, with the average age of death being around 25 to 27 years old. So let me break it down to you by the sexes. So the men were responsible for clearing the swampy fields with what you're looking at is a picture of a huge cypress tree. And all of those, what are called knots, are new trees that are coming up through the water. They would have to wade through this water. Of course, there were alligators and snakes in the water. And because of the size of the trees, they would have a lot of accidents from falling trees, falling off trees, and so many other things. And each field took 5 to 7 years to clear. This is a picture of my mother, and she's on the call. So hi, Mom, and my grandmother's there too. Hi, Mommy. But my mother is 5'4", and she is standing beside a cypress tree. So just so that you can get an idea of the girth that tree would have in its circumference. And that tree would happen to be on really the smaller size, because the cypress trees can be as large in circumference as 8 feet around. So for the women in West Africa, they were responsible for the seed. They were the protectors of the seed. And so for the women, not only did they protect it, if there was a warring tribe that would come and say, try to steal the food or burn their food down, they would actually take the seeds and braid it into their cornrows so that they always had seeds to feed themselves another day. Once they would plant the seeds, they would also be responsible for harvesting the seeds. And again, they were in their bare feet. And the image that you're looking at is of the women literally using a pestle and a flail to separate the seeds from the husk. Now, of course, in enslavement, children were also involved. And so they were used to bang the pots to scare away birds from the fields. And I've been on a rice field, and to try and keep the birds off of the rice from eating the rice is a very difficult thing to do. And even with all of today's modern technology, the farmers that are cultivating rice right now are still struggling with ways of trying to figure it out. So for the children to be able to bang the pots and scare away the birds, and for them to be able to, in some cases, cultivate over 4 million pounds of rice a year, that is an incredible amount of work that they all had to do. So as a result, the origin and incredible success of rice in America is directly tied to the history of the Gullah Geechee community. And because of the labor that they provided and the wealth that they afforded people, they were directly responsible for rice becoming one of the most important cash crops in the South and the #1 agricultural crop in the United States. And so basically, because of the Gullah Geechee being here and the isolation that they had on the Sea Islands, that's why they were able to really begin one of the few indigenous cultures in the United States. Today, the Gullah Geechee corridor has been identified from North Carolina to Florida, and it is federally designated. And primarily, the Gullah Geechee lived along the Sea Islands, along the coastline, and based on the federal designation, to about 45 miles inland. So what is a Gullah Geechee? Not only, like I said, is it one of the few indigenous cultures, but because they are the direct descendants of enslaved West African people, they were able to maintain their customs and traditions because of that isolation. And a lot of the time people ask me, so what is a Gullah and what is a Geechee? So unfortunately, there is no one answer, but there are several different answers that I can give you. In West Africa, there was a Gola tribe and a Gwala tribe. In addition to the fact that the majority of the enslaved people came from Angola. So the word Gullah is said to be essentially a derivative of either of those different words. In the technical sense, the Gullah are from North Carolina and South Carolina. And the Geechee, the Geechee is technically Georgia and Florida. And of course, between South Carolina and Georgia, or just close to the Georgia-South Carolina border, there is the Ogeechee River, which is another reason why people think that it's a derivative, Geechee comes from there. But there was also a Kisii tribe in Florida. So of course, that's all very technical. And as I mentioned, my grandmother is on the call tonight, and she grew up with her sisters always calling themselves Geechees, but my grandmother is from Charleston. And so because of that difference, of course, people moved. And so there are a lot of different schools of thought that the Geechee is the language and the Gullah are the people, or sometimes people say that the Gullah is the language and the Geechee are the people. So there are, like I said, there is a lot of different schools of thought to it, but that's why when you hear someone talk about it, to be all inclusive, they just say, I'm a Gullah Geechee. And so what made the Gullah different about their ability to hold on to their traditions, because they labored under a different kind of bondage than in interior southern states that usually had either the chattel or gang system, which was traditionally a cruel and excessive labor that essentially was called that they had to work from when you can see to when you can't see. In the Low Country and along the coastline, what was different was that they were able to operate under what was called a task system, which meant that if they had a specific amount of work that they needed to do during the day, once they were able to finish that work, they were able to go on and do other things like farm or fish for themselves. The reason why the task system was very prevalent along the coastline is because the Sea Islands land was essentially considered garbage land. And so the enslavers didn't want to stay there because it was so hot, malaria and yellow fever and all of these diseases, and the bugs were really intolerable. So they left the enslaved to an overseer and essentially enabled them to be able to do the work that they needed to do, as well as maintain some of their traditions and cultures. And sorry, sometimes I get ahead of myself, so I repeat myself with the slides. So let me break down some of the issues of the culture. So between the culture, the traditions, the religion, the language, the foodways, and the lifestyle, that's what really separated the Gullah Geechee from a lot of the other enslaved people that were in the United States. So let me start with the culture. Today, there's so many elements of Gullah culture that have been woven into American society and really our daily living that it's really hard to count. The culture itself places a tremendous value not only on the ancestors as well as the elders, and specifically the kind of significance and wisdom that they are able to impart on the community is really valuable. For example, in Hilton Head, the elders in some cases are the head of the village or community. And so in Hilton Head, for example, there is a Native Island leadership that consists of elders who are responsible for making sure that different issues and things that affect the community are overseen and or taken to the town of Hilton Head to make sure that the town has that kind of representation. So that African tradition still continues today. Traditions. So with the Gullah Geechee, it's a face-to-face culture. Of course, during enslavement, people didn't have possessions that they could just pass down to each other. So what information or skills or anything like that, they would have to pass it down orally. And so family stories, life lessons, any kind of information, or even memories of Africa and those connections, those were the type of things that were passed down from generation to generation. And so when it came to sharing life-sustaining information and even traditional skills like net making or quilting, they were some of the most important lessons that were passed down to the generations. And some of those skills like net making and quilting and even sweetgrass basket making are still being practiced today. With the quilts, they were not only functional, but they also had practical uses. A lot of the quilts were designed, of course, for warmth and you know, to be used as a blanket, but in a lot of cases, they were used to tell stories. And sometimes if someone was escaping, they would use the quilt as directions. They would make the different elements of where they needed to go or details where they needed to go into the quilt so that they already had essentially a map with them. Or sometimes the quilts were made to represent or even honor someone who was within the community, like say someone who was an herbalist or someone who would practice medicine, things like that. They would make specific quilts for them. And when it came to the sweetgrass baskets, those were also functional as well. I mean, today they're very beautiful and we use them for decoration, but back then the baskets were used as a regular part of daily life. And the large ones that were kind of like a tray, they were used as fanning baskets, which would help to separate the rice from the husk. So let me talk a little bit about religion. First of all, religion and the church are at the core of the Gullah Geechee and African American life and culture. And it's still, and it was back then as it is today. And I'm sure most of you, if you have ever seen a politician during, you know, campaign times or campaign season, they would go to the Black church as part of their campaign stops. And the reason why they did that is because the church has always been a strong part and of the foundation of the family, and as well as how it's structured. Not only that, the church was always the place where safety and vital and life-sustaining information, education, direction, and grassroots political activism would come out of. And so for the Gullah community, religion was as important as your daily part of life. And a lot of discipline and structure also came out of the church as well. At one point, and I mentioned this earlier, I did a documentary on the religious tradition of seeking. Joining the church was considered a rite of passage for young children or young preteens, and that was called seeking. And so seeking is a time of reflection where, if you see in the image here, there's a rope with 9 knots, and they would take that rope and tie it around their forehead. So to anyone that they encountered, they would have the knowledge that they were in a mode of reflection and seeking, and not to be disturbed. And so during that time, while they were seeking, they would isolate themselves, sometimes in the woods or even in a cemetery, where they could be closer to the ancestors until they had a point where they would receive either some direction or a dream that would give them a dream that they could take to their spiritual parent to be deciphered. And if the dream was considered acceptable, then they could join the church. If, because it was a child, they were playing around and they didn't, they aren't doing what they're supposed to, they would have to go back and start again. And so seeking was something that had been done for generations, even from African tradition. And in some areas of the Sea Islands, seeking was done as far into the 1970s. One of the things that was really important to the Gullah community, and still is gospel music and the different kinds of hymns that they used. Music was really important because during enslavement, a lot of the enslaved weren't able to talk, but they were able to sing. They were allowed to sing. So they used the music and the words not only to establish work rhythms, to do motivation, as well as provide different information for escape when necessary in a call and response format. One of the other traditions that has been passed down through the generations is called the ring shout. And the ring shout was a discrete form of communicating messages to one another in a call and response format. And in this image, you'll see that there's a group of people and they are essentially marching and stomping in a circle. And normally they would be doing a call and response. And because at one point in South Carolina, at least, to me, it's one of the dumbest laws on the books in South Carolina, was that slaves could no longer use drums. So of course, as ingenious as the Gullah were, they would use their feet, their bodies, and their mouths to make the different kinds of sounds and messages that they needed to share with each other. Jumping the broom is another one of those traditions that is still practiced today. And jumping the broom, if you haven't heard of it before, it's what is done at the end of a wedding ceremony to indicate that the couple is making a visual transformation from being single into matrimony. And it is also another sign of the bride, showing that she is accepting being domestically part of the relationship. So let me talk a little bit about the language. The Gullah Geechee language is an English Creole-based language with West African influences. And the sound is very similar, yet unique to the culture. And earlier, when I mentioned that there were a lot of ships that actually stopped in the Caribbean, a lot of the Caribbean islands, Barbados, Jamaica, Trinidad, and so on, Brazil, Cuba, all of them have Gullah influences that because of the transatlantic slave trade, and the Creole base in their language is also very similar because of that. One of the things that I really find is ingenious in the language is that because during slavery, of course, they were smart enough to learn English and speak it the way that the enslavers wanted them to speak. And because the plantation owners thought that the language was ignorant or broken English, but to me, it was really ingenious way of communicating so that they could communicate amongst themselves without sharing what they didn't want to share in front of the plantation owners. And, you know, earlier I mentioned that there are a lot of different elements of the culture that people are using in our daily lives. And there are a lot of English words that actually have Gullah origins. I'm sure everybody has either heard or said the word gumbo, the word tote, jukebox, the word kumbaya, which is the Girl Scout song. That means come by here. Yam, jitters, the word phony. Those peanuts. Peanuts are called goobers in Gullah, and that candy, the goobers, is a, you know, another throwback to Gullah, as well as the word tater and nana. And here's some translations for you. Wata is water. I've been cracking teeth for a long time, which means I've been doing a lot of talking. One of my favorites is dawn, which means day clean, and nam, which also means eat. So let me talk a little bit about the foodways. So Gullah food is one of the oldest African and American culinary traditions that's found in the United States today. And what was really impressive about the Gullah is that they were able to utilize what they had and you make something out of nothing. And on the bottom here, you can get a little idea of what the average slave was given as far as their rations were concerned. With the Gullah, of course, if they had an enslaver who provided land to them so that they could fish and grow their own food, sometimes they had a little bit more than just this list. But of course, because they were primarily growing rice, rice was really a significant staple that they had every day. And just to give you an idea, a lot of the enslaved, they only had one pot. And so those one pot meals that we consider staples in our diet today really can trace their beginnings back to the Gullah. So meals like the red rice, which is white rice with tomato sauce and sausage or bacon, chicken and rice, shrimp and grits, fried crab rice because they were on the coast. They were able to get fish, and even peas and rice. Those are the kind of meals that they had on a regular basis. So let me talk a little bit about the lifestyle. So what I love about the Gullah culture is that it's really based in kindness. And so when one had, all had. No one starved, No one was homeless. Everybody took care of them, took care of each other. And just like that village mentality, the children within the community were all taken care of by everyone who was any adults that were around. And so if a house needed to be built, the community would come together to build it. If someone specialized in the woodworking and someone specialized in brick making, or if someone specialized in iron work, they would all come together and share the skills. And what was also interesting is that it was based on barter. There was no money that changed hands. No one was really really indebted to someone monetarily. That was never the expectation. Existence was given by one's ability to help and do for each other, and just out of plain respect. So after emancipation, education was really important. And it was primarily important because the elders didn't want their future generations not to have the type of, they didn't want them to have the type of lifestyle that they had. They wanted them to be able to really blend into society. And so in addition to education, lessons of deportment were extraordinarily important lessons and skills that elders and parents wanted their children to have. So being able to dress well, carry yourself well as being educated, those were the kind of lessons that were really important. And of course, with education, it would provide them a better lifestyle than their ancestors had previously. So I mentioned earlier that part of what Low Country Gullah does is not only preserving the culture and sharing the culture, but also protecting the land. So why is highlighting Gullah Geechee culture so important today? So for primarily, and again, going back to my own journey, people are starving for not only historic information, but to also learn about new cultures, as well as develop a genealogic connection to their heritage on a global level. And so for me, the importance of that was my ability to really find a grounding, not only in my culture, but also where I come from, where my family comes from. And so for the Black American, African American community, especially because there isn't a lot of genealogical records that we can utilize to identify a perfect historical lineage, having a tangible connection to the Gullah Geechee culture really provides a priceless sense of identity that that a lot of people like myself have been looking for. And unfortunately, you know, as I was mentioning, finding a lot of documentation is very hard. And one of the things that exists and what I call is the slave wall of 1870, which really is where a lot of the records comes to a screeching halt, because a lot of the enslavers often did not record their slaves' names or information because of their status as property. And so up until the abolishment of slavery in 1865, those records in some cases are non-existent. So the first census records started in 1870, which is why that's sometimes the wall that a lot of people hit. So I keep mentioning the journey that I've been having, But what I realized is that I'm not alone, that 89% of Black and African Americans who are descendants of not only enslaved people, but those that were within the Gullah Geechee corridor and can trace themselves back to all of those states, North Carolina, Florida, Georgia, and South Carolina, are Geechee or Gullah Geechee, and most of them don't even know it. And so for me, just like a lot of other Black African Americans, when you're able to trace your ancestry back to a location, just like the Gullah Geechee corridor, even if you can't trace yourself back to Africa, being able to trace yourself to the Gullah Geechee corridor at least gives you something tangible that you can connect to. Another thing that is really important to tell as part of the Gullah Geechee story is Mitchellville. Mitchellville is on Hilton Head. It was established in 1862, and it's the first historic town of self-governed, newly freed slaves in the United States. They had their own governmental structure, their own wages, their own retail opportunities, as well as South Carolina's first compulsory education program in the state. Because of the location of the Gullah being on the Sea Islands, the Gullah Geechee were among the first to join the US colored troops and the Union Army in the Civil War. And because of that dedication and loyalty to the United States and wanting to fight for freedom, that's just yet another tangible and incredible part of the Gullah Geechee story that a lot of people don't really know or recognize. So what about today's Gullah Geechee American? The culture is alive and well. It is alive in a lot of people like myself who are still not only connecting with the culture, but also continuing with its practices. But because the culture has begun to kind of dissipate, a lot of the practices have diminished over time because people have been moving away from the Sea Islands. And so the importance of my work is that and one of the things that I really try to strive to share and teach people and educate is that the culture and the impact of it needs to be recognized for its significance, not only for its contributions to American society, but as well as its contributions to its and role in American history. So unfortunately, because a lot of people, and most of them are elders now, the language has not been transferred generation to generation, because at one time, a lot of people were told that speaking the language was considered ignorant or backwards talking, or they would even be teased for having a Gullah accent, or a lot of children were even told not to speak the language, especially out of the house. So what has happened is a lot of Gullah Geechee have learned to code switch depending on what situation they're in and who they're talking to. And that's one of the reasons why the language has not been passed down as vigorously as it could have been. And so early on, I mentioned that Low Country Gullah is, its sole purpose is not only preserving the culture, but also protecting the land. And so the website has become an interconnected resource between a lot of the different cultural assets that exist within the Gullah Geechee corridor, so that not only can together we educate and document the Gullah Geechee history and culture, but also ensure that historic Gullah land is protected. And so years ago, being identified as a Gullah or a saltwater Geechee or rice-eating Geechee was considered an insult and looked down upon. And as a result, cultural pride and wanting to be identified that way really eroded the culture and the language, and that's why it hasn't been passed down. So I can't do the culture its due justice by preserving it and sharing it without also working on saving historic Gullah land and helping to resolve heirs property. And so for the Gullah, acreage is not just about land that has value. It is a priceless, tangible, and visible daily reminder of the blood, sweat, and tears that the ancestors experienced. And the value has made historic Gullah land the culture's greatest asset. And I always tell this story when I talk about the land. There was a commercial years ago, it was a Visa commercial, and it kind of went like this. A day in the park with your son buying a hot dog for $8. The price of baseball tickets, $30. A day in the park with your son, priceless. And that's what Gullah land is. It's not about the money. It's not about anything but the priceless value that it has, because the land is not only a gift from the ancestors, it's the family's heritage and a legacy, as well as generational wealth. And that's why the attachment to land is so very important. Most of the land that still exists today is called heirs property. And heirs property is land that was passed down from generation to generation. And usually there is no clear title to the land because the original purchaser may have had 100 or 1,000 heirs by now. And so they were not transferring the property with the legal paperwork that we require today. And in West African tradition, land was of God's, not of man's. So a piece of paper is not, or was not, a cultural part of way of identifying the land. And so that's why heirs property is such a significant issue today. And unfortunately, Gullah Geechee, because of the cloudy title and the lack of legal paperwork that goes along with it, a lot of Gullah Geechee are not able to get financing. If there's a storm, FEMA just changed this within the last year or so, but for a lot of heirs property owners, if a storm came through, FEMA would not provide financial assistance because the paperwork is so cloudy. That has recently changed within the last couple of years, but there are so many different issues that the Gullah are experiencing just because of their connection to heirs property. And so because of that, most of the Gullah are land rich, but cash poor because of the lack of financing and assistance that they can get. So this is a sign of a home, the Blygens. When I did one of the Gullah, the first family articles, I did the Blygen family, and this sign was at the front door. And I can't explain heirs property any better than this, that William Blygen dedicated his house in honor of my grandfather, William Blygen Sr., who sweated and died on this land for his children to come. I mean, that's heirs property. That is really the foundation of why it is so prevalent to the culture. And unfortunately, there are 11 states that have heirs property issue, more so along the coastline in the corridor, but heirs property is not just within the coastline. And so usually what happens is when the elders purchase land without that legal documentation, and their heirs then give the land to their heirs, and usually the owner of the property might die without a will and or that proper documentation for the property. Unfortunately, in a lot of states, especially in South Carolina, where I'm from, if there is a single heir, it is absolutely legal that if one heir out of, say, 100 or 1,000 or whatever the number is, wants to sell and no one else wants to sell, it's possible for them to trigger a partition sale. And most courts will force the sale of the property, and the property is usually sold at auction. If that's $1 million property, chances are the property sold at auction will go for pennies on the dollar. And so what has happened is not only is heirs property detrimental to families, but it's also detrimental to communities as well, because of the way that land loss is being eroding so quickly. So just to give you a couple of statistics, in 1910, former slaves amassed about 15 million acres. And today it's less than 8 million. To kind of drill down a little, because I'm from Hilton Head, on Hilton Head, the original Gullah residents owned about 3,500 acres. Today, that number is down below 700. It's probably closer to 600. And there's only 8% of the population of Gullah is left on the island. And Defusky Island, which is between Hilton Head and Savannah, now is home to only 9 native Gullah Island residents. So the land loss is significant and it's at a critical state. And that's why the work to preserve every acre that we can is so important. So thank you so much for listening to me and learning about the work that I'm doing, as well as honoring me tonight and recognizing the work that I'm doing. In addition to the website, I do have a podcast. The website is lowcountrygullah.com, and the podcast is also Low Country Gullah. And of course, I'm on every social media that you can think of, all under Low Country Gullah as well. And with that being said, are there any questions that I might be able to take? Guess I'll put up.
I have so many, but I'm going to give it to the people, let them say, whether they're going to say anything. Just going to say quickly, thank you so much for this very informative presentation. I enjoyed it and do so much, and I wanted to just give you that. I'll shut up, let people go.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm now seeing some chat, some questions in the chat. Could someone tell me how to get the sound?
That's a little farther out. That's a little old.
Yeah, well, I couldn't see these while I was doing it. Thank you, Rachel. I appreciate that. Thank you, Leo. Rachel is a Gullah. Pat, hello. Is there, was Rachel, did you have a question?
I did, yes. I am, like I said in the chat, South Carolina, Gullah Geechee-ish. My grandfather was, but he didn't really tell me much about it. But my question is, I just recently learned about I hopped on a little bit late, so if you've already answered this question, cool. But I noticed like there's a lot of imagery with the bottles, with the trees in the bottles, and that's something that we see a lot in the South. And I'd been doing my own research on what that means, but I'd like to hear you know that to mean.
Well, there's a couple of reasons for it. During enslavement, a lot of the enslavers would use fear and superstition to keep slaves in line, essentially, from escaping. And in addition to that, there's also West African tradition of using bottle trees. And so the blue bottles were used because the color was thought that the spirits would confuse it between the water and the sky. And if you've ever seen the haint blue ceilings and porches, throughout the South, same concept, that the spirits would not cross through, or they would rise up. And with the bottles, they would go into the bottle at night. And then with the heat of the day or the sun rising, it was thought that it would burn off the spirit that was captured in the bottle.
Thank you. I appreciate
Sure,
it. I
absolutely.
did some research on it and heard a lot of different things, but that's definitely awesome. Thank you.
That's
Sure.
great. On my porch. I'm glad you asked that because I had the same question. I also want to point to Lorenzo. Lorenzo, you have your hand up. If you want to put it in the chat or unmute, please ask your question.
Yeah, regarding the part of the land, can y'all hear me?
Yes.
Here.
Okay, yeah, there was in regard to land, there's a lot of uncertainty about climate change, and this is in the low country, so there is a big danger there. And I was just wondering, next to land, as far as value, what do y'all think is something that, how do I put this, something that is close to the value of land that we should also be looking after or seeking?
I don't think I'm clear on your question. Are you saying other than the land that exists, what other things can be done?
Yeah, other than land, as far as I guess objects of value, what is something that um, we should be wanting to hold on to as far as Gullah Geechee culture?
Well, in a nutshell, I would say traditions. I would say the language. I would say, net making, sweetgrass basket making, quilt making, bateau making. Just as an example, on Hilton Head, years ago there were several bateau makers. Now, within the several miles of Hilton Head, I know of only two, and they're both elders. And so that tradition of bateau making might not survive because young kids are not taking up those kind of skills, or someone's not teaching young children about those skills. So there are so many different elements that could be and should be passed down so that those cultural connections can continue.
Yeah, I saw a Beto on at Pinpoint.
Yes, yes. Matter of fact, there's a picture of that bateau in my presentation. You know, if you remember it. But yes, you know, there's just so many different things. Like the sweetgrass baskets. You know, yes, there are some people who are still doing it, but you know, it should be a skill that more know about. Right? And quilt making, you know, none of those things should be a dying art. It just shouldn't be.
Thank you. That was a really good question, and it kind of builds on the question I wanted to ask. What are the practical ways that we can protect the land, both like literally with the work that you're doing, and also by supporting organization, obviously, but also like what are things we can do day to day to maintain and preserve?
Well, you know, that's a great question, and I get asked that a lot. First of all, education. You know, a lot of people don't know that heirs property even exists, or that there's a problem with heirs property, or people are losing their land because of heirs property. So I think starting the conversations to share the information so that people are aware, that's the first thing that anybody can do. Secondly, is really starting to pay attention to what's going on in our communities, because there's so many places, like there are 11 states that have heirs property. So from, say, Texas, if you know, the entire South up to North Carolina, you know, all the way to Florida. So all of those states, they have heirs property issues where there are either families who have land that are losing their land, or there are farmers who are trying to hold on to their land. You know, it's a Black problem. You know, it's a Black people problem that we all need to talk about, and we need to do what we can do to help to hold on to that. Because if we don't, and it's all gone, then, you know, we don't have the opportunity for the American dream, you know, to have generational wealth, to be able to pass things down to, you know, future generations. So it's that's what's important about it. If we don't talk about it and we just ignore the problem, then, you know, one day we're going to turn around and it's all going to be gone, and we're all going to wonder, you know, where did it go? And to me, that would be criminal, because, you know, when I talk about Gullah land, you know, I always talk about the Indian culture and even the Hawaiian culture. Their cultures, not to say that they're gone or have disappeared, but what's similar is that the Indian and Hawaiian cultures, they've lost their land. And if the Gullah lose their land, the culture will get dissipated to a point where the Hawaiians and the Indians are. You know, right now we have pockets of communities that are Gullah, that have land, that are maintaining the traditions and the culture. But if they can't stay where they are, then you know, what happens to the community and the culture then, and the traditions? You're muted.
I just said, yeah, no, that's fair. That's a really fair point. Thank you for asserting the importance of that.
Yeah, and to me, that's the most important thing, you know, that people realize the connection of the culture to the land. You know, when you connect it that way, then you realize that the real significance of protecting the land, because protecting the land is protecting the culture.
Word, word, word. Yeah. I'm writing that down.
You can use that.
That's gonna go. I'm gonna attribute that to you on social media. Um, Thank you so much. Oh man, this has been a fantastic, night. Usually, we try to keep it on under hour, but today I was like, no, go, please. I've learned so much. I found this very fascinating, and I really appreciate it because, like Rachel even brought up, this is a thing that I filmed from Savannah. I don't know if they're Gullah Geechee, but I want to go and find out, and that's a thing that I would love to be a part of, and even if I'm not, just to preserve because it's so important to Black culture and Indigenous culture in America. Like you said, this is one of our few Indigenous cultures that we still have a real good connection to. We need to preserve that. So I appreciate you so much. Thank you for all the work that you're doing. I want to encourage people. I dropped your website in the chat, so I'll encourage people to go to that. I also am going to redrop your Cash App. It's LMGS13 with a little cash sign in the front of it. When you go to search for it, please, people, please support our Radical Truth Teller. Please support the work you're doing. And, anyone listening to this video, I'm also going to say the same thing because we need more of this. I appreciate you so much. This was fantastic.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. And I see my sister Pat in the center of my screen. So thank you. I love you. And, appreciate all of the work that you do on the other side of the water.
Yeah, I say.
We have probably 4 minutes, a little bit of time, just real quick. I see Lorenzo, you got your hand up. Unless it's from before. You want to say something real quick, and then I'll do a little closing. We can get out of here.
Yeah, I'll do one more question. I just wanted to know if there was anybody who could speak with me back and forth with the Gullah Geechee language, because I've been trying to learn it for the last year and I've gotten pretty good at it, but I need somebody who can kind of back and forth with me so I can get it down correctly.
Well, I will defer that question to Pat because I'm learning from her. I'm still trying. So she's more advanced than I am.
Okay.
Can you hear? Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
I hear you.
Yeah. So if you're local to Savannah, you just need to come and sit with us for a while. On a Friday afternoon, if you come by, there's a fish fry going on somewhere, and you'll hear lots of fluent Gullah Geechee language. You'll hear it in the fish markets. We still have a few of those left, and you'll hear them talking. They'll talk about stories. You'll hear their dialect. You'll feel their rhythm. You just have to come and sit around the community so that you can pick up on the language. It's not something they do in a public setting all the time, but come and sit with us and we'll show you how to loosen your tongue up and speak a little Gullah Geechee,
Okay, that sounds good. You just said to like the fish markets?
Yes.
Okay.
You go to the fish market like Rousseau over on 37th, on Abercorn and 40th Street. And they go there to get their fish in the mornings because there's a fish fry going on somewhere in New City. And that's where they get their fish when they don't want to go out and catch it. They still do it to this day. And Nancy Seafood and several other places, just come by and I'll tell you all the secret spots where we hang out and you'll hear the language. You'll also hear the language, not so much anymore, but used to have a language kind of party every first of the month. The people go downtown to the water department to pay for their water bill. And you'll hear them fussing and ting, talking about the man wants $17.55. And I ain't got no 55 cents. So they go to the person next to them and we put the money together for one of them. So you would hear that kind of language, but it's not there anymore because.
Oh,
Pat, you just went mute. Pat, you just muted yourself.
there you go. Okay, there you go. Do you want to finish your thought, Sister Pat?
Yes, that's it. Just wanted to say kudos to Luana for her work.
It happened again. You muted again.
Thank you. Whatever you said, I know you said it with love, so thank you.
She's going to represent the Truth Telling Project in a very powerful way. She's educating every place she goes. She's amazing, and thank you for being an added value to our community and helping them to understand the Gullah Geechee community. Thank you so much. Your work
Thank
is
you.
phenomenal. Your work is phenomenal.
Thank you, as is yours, but thank you. I really appreciate that.
That's it.
Thank you so much. I can't give a better closing than that, Pat. So I'm gonna let y'all go. And thank you one more time. Thank you again twice, and thank you a third time for coming and blessing us with this. I really appreciate you, and I want to thank everyone for coming. Everyone, give it up. Now, let's clap out. I hope y'all have a good rest of y'all night.
Thank you, everybody,
Thank you.
That's it.
and good evening.
Thank you.
Night. Asha.